My name is Jessica Brockington, and 20 years ago, I started a newspaper called The Bridge Leader. It was in Washington Heights where I lived. It had one of the highest murder rates in the city, and one of my goals in publishing was to bring an even-handed voice to the neighbors, to the news that was being told about my neighbors and my neighborhood. 20 years later, one of my goals in journalism school was to learn to be digital and multimedia, to get with the times. And I chose social journalism because at its heart, it felt very much like old school community journalism. It wasn't, you assume that people know their own stories and that they can tell them, and you let that happen. And at the beginning, the community I chose was the interfaith community of New York. So the first thing I did, of course, was to go and follow God on social media. Thank you for that laugh. So I wanted to, just to be clear, what I felt interfaith wasn't, at least for my terms. I wasn't interested in reporting on the most extreme elements of the faith community in New York City. So I wasn't interested in the most isolated or the extreme or the fundamentalist groups. What I found and decided interfaith would be the collaborative, the progressive, the civically engaged organizations. And of course, Trump gave us quite a bit to work with this year. New York City of Love was how I framed my reporting. I spent a lot of time in the streets. I tweeted, I made explainers and social videos. I wrote stories for Medium, and I had two goals. One of them was professional. It was to learn to use all of these new technologies. And the other was to amplify voices that are not getting heard in the noise of extreme reporting. I'm about to fall off of here, so I won't. And I found along the way that a lot of faith leaders are still really stuck in old-fashioned ways of communicating, and they weren't taking on the new media. So I just wanted to point out that when I talk about extreme voices, a Quaker group, it's a peace activist group, the American Friends Service Committee, has written that in 3 months in 2015, they looked at 600 news articles and found that the major networks provided no coverage of nonviolent responses to extremism. So let's see. So I went to a lot of events. I tweeted, I filmed and tweeted. The UN Forum on Faith, did a lot of slideshows. I went to interfaith seders and church basements and reported the stories and tried to amplify what was going on in this community to get a sense of, what was happening in the sanctuary movement and in Dhaka and in North Korea, and how were people of faith and civic mindedness talking about these issues. One interfaith group had a candidates forum. They did actually 12 of those across the city. This was Dhaka. These will be people that you know if you've been reporting on these communities. I had a chance to interview Ruth Messenger last week. That was kind of a highlight for me personally. Invited into a mosque during an Oxfam event. These were people I interviewed about North Korea. So there's a lot of, there was a lot of just down in the streets reporting. And I wanted to highlight these folks in particular. It's really kind of hippie. Like, the interfaith community is really the last time Americans were engaged like this was the 1960s, and there's this paradigm that people are still using. It's a toolkit that people are still using. Whoa, let's not do that again. But I also wanted to point out that they needed to kind of get with it. And I wanted to introduce you to another friend of mine here. This is Jeff Trenchard, who's this badass immigration attorney.
Racism isn't a speed bump.
Do you have any
on
volume
the
here?
Otherwise smooth American highway, right? Like it's the asphalt. It's the nature of our system.
Okay, we don't have to go too far. So when he had a major win down at ICE and he got a client out, he put on social media that, you know, he wasn't walking around singing "This Little Light of Mine." He was doing rap hands, which I thought was kind of fun. I attended a digital ministry boot camp, and that kind of set me for my practicum in a way, because I started hearing about the concerns that faith leaders had about being in social media. And it was the exact intersection between my personal development as a journalist, as a digital journalist, and the reporting I was actually doing on my community. I retweeted Paul Rauschenbusch, who is a thought leader in this kind of thing. And I think the quotes that I selected were really kind of moving. Brick and mortar religious traditions were the slowest to realize that the truth is up for grabs. We hear that it echoed in the fake news discussion. He questioned, what is community going to mean? You know, when 2 or 3 are gathered online, is Jesus there? You know, is there a minion? Think about augmented reality and Bible stories. What would Jesus look like on the cross? These are real. And then justice. You know, internet can be leveraged to promote justice, but it is itself a justice issue. It's access, regarding access, and it's rigged. So I put out a survey to my community and asked just about how they were using digital ministry in their congregations. And I just found that these were a bunch of Luddites. People were really not using this stuff. Most of them were really hard to find, too. Like just getting in touch to say, hey, I did a social video with you guys not too long ago. I wanted to share it with you, and finding like the email didn't work. It was just the best way to find, you know, Reverend Hauser, who I showed you a picture of before, was really to walk down 71st Street and say, hey, what are you doing today? Otherwise, it was almost impossible to get him. I got an opportunity to follow one of the digital ministry thought leaders, Jim Keats. His title at Riverside Church is Associate Minister of Digital Strategy and Online Engagement. So he's really at the forefront right now. So what I just realized was that I was sitting in the middle of a newsroom of very thoughtful communicators right here. And I wondered what they would say to my community. How does that, you know, what advice would they have? They certainly, many of them come from faith traditions. So I took a page out of Jeremy's page book with the munchkins and Carrie's with the sign saying, hey, what would you say to faith leaders? And sat in the newsroom. I figured if I could get through 50 munchkins, I'd probably have some good interviews. I taped them all one afternoon, and I asked people, what advice do you have for faith leaders getting into social media? Oh, and have a donut. And I asked staff. I lined them all up, and I tweeted them out in 2 mornings. And they were wonderful. Here's some of the stuff that people said. Every single person had something different to say. And it was really gratifying because not only did I feel like I was elevating my community here and voices that I care very much about, but they were also really speaking to some of the issues that, that faith leaders would enjoy hearing about. So I've put in front some of they got over 500 views on Twitter, which was really nice. These are some of I won't go through all of them, there's no time. And this was some of the feedback that I got, whether it was comments or retweeting, or people connecting me into their own hashtags and the conversations that are happening there. And I also realized, this is my last slide, but I did want to say that I realized that, you know, here I've been sitting doing a Twitter storm for a group that isn't on Twitter, which makes no sense at all. And I thought, so how do I bridge that? Because I do think it's a really important conversation. And I realized that the next step is to go to Facebook, where there are slightly more faith leaders, connecting with their congregations there. And then also to, I think, a meetup, like something really good and old-fashioned. And I think social journalism gives us the latitude to do stuff like that and encourage us to have real connections with people. So I thank you.